to help us be that way. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about our speaker tonight. His name is Mike Jackson. Mike joined the State Chamber in 2014 after serving for 10 years in the House of Representatives, the last 2 of which he was the Speaker pro tempore, which I just learned what that was today. That means when the Speaker's not there, he's in charge. So I learned something new today. He presided over many sessions, passed many bills that were good for business, and prior to serving in the legislature, he was a field rep for Senator Inhofe. So I'm just going to turn it right over to Mike. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and it's my privilege, and thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to come here and just talk a little bit about our state questions, as well as the 2016 elections that are about ready to occur. So, a little bit about the presentation itself. We'll start off with a quote from my president and CEO, and that's Fred Morgan, who also served in the legislature and was one of my mentors in the House of Representatives. One of the American dreams is to be successful at creating your own business. The State Chamber protects that American dream. A little bit about what we do at the State Chamber. We lobby at 23rd and Lincoln, aerospace and technology, economic development and taxation, education and workforce development, energy and natural resources, which I am a lobbyist and actually focus on those issues, healthcare, human resources and labor law, lawsuit reform, manufacturing, military affairs, which I also represent for the chamber, served on the state BRAC commission for a few years, and small business issues, transportation, which I represent as well, and workers' compensation. Some of the accomplishments of the State Chamber: landmark workers' compensation reform. We passed that in 2013. We also protected tax incentives at work. Not all of them, but the ones that do bring jobs to our state. Clarified unemployment benefits for businesses and workers. Made funding for state pensions sustainable. And we've been working on that at the State Chamber for a number of years now. Passed the SHOP Act to increase federal funding for local hospitals, and that's one of the issues that we continue to see statewide. And we've led efforts to pass e-fairness legislation that levels the playing field for online retailers and Main Street businesses. So those are some of the things that we do at the State Chamber. We lobby at 23rd and Lincoln in the House and Senate. A little bit about myself and Nicole Boyles, who is also here this evening. We put together a program called Chamber Action Network. And one of the things that we try to do at the State Chamber is to inform all of our local partners on some of the issues that are coming up, as well as provide them with tools like you see here in every election. So we put together a vote early toolkit. We put together a vote by mail and a voter registration toolkit, as well as other things, to try to get people to get out and vote. We believe that's extremely important, especially those that have been involved in business, and making sure that at the end of the day, those that have been involved get out and make their voice well known. 2016, why is it important? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the state questions, but also I was elected in 2004, and it was the first largest class in state history, if you exclude 1907, which was when we started as a state. But in 2004, we had large turnover. And this is the first year since that time that we are going to have very large turnover again, because those that I was elected with in 2004 are now term limited, and we will see on November 8th. And by the way, you have until October 14th to actually register. So if you're not registered, you can still register. But we will see 45 of 149 legislators actually brand new in 2017 when they are sworn in as newly elected. That's a 30% turnover in the House and Senate. I believe that that's 13 senators and 32 House members minimum. Now that is basically saying that if that number were to become true, then no incumbent in the state of Oklahoma will have lost. At this point, we already know 45 are brand new. Second most turnover in state history, excluding 1907. Of 94 incumbents up for re-election in 2016, 77 faced challenges this election cycle. That's almost 80% of everybody that it was available, because only the half of the Senate is up for election in 2016. Then all your House members are up in 2016. Highest percentage in recent memory. We've gone back a few years to try to see if that many incumbents have ever been challenged, and we cannot find any evidence that it's ever been that high. 3 incumbents have already been defeated, 2 in Duncan and 1 in Tulsa. And this year, there will be 7 state questions on the ballot. Now, just to give you a sense, you can go to the election board and you can actually download those questions and see it in its entirety right now, and I would encourage you to do so. We also provide this as part of our Chamber Action Network, and this is a guide that tries to give you what supporters say and what opponents say. It also talks a little bit, and I'll talk about this here in a second, about the judicial ratings and the judicial votes that are up during the 2016 election cycle. This year, there are 2 from the Supreme Court that are up for retention, and there are 3 from the Court of Civil Appeals. Just to give you a little bit of a sense, that is the OklahomaCivilJustice.com is our website. This is a group actually does this for the state chamber and for the Civil Justice Council. They do a independent look at all the decisions that were made that have some sort of a dissent. The group that actually puts this together does it for 17 states. A passing score, or a score that would basically, it looks at whether or not the judge sides on the side of reducing liability for business, keeping liability the same for business, or increasing liability for business. A score of 50 to 70 basically means that the Supreme Court Justice or the Court of Civil Appeals is, if they're between 50 and 70, then they have basically decided to keep status quo. If they are above the 70 threshold, they've been historically on the side of reducing liability to business. If they are below 50, and as you can see here on the screen, there are a few that are below 50, they have traditionally sided on the side of increasing liability to business. So we provide that on civiljustice.com. We provide that in this booklet that we have provided everybody here. You can also download that on State Chamber at the okstatechamber.com. You can download this booklet in its entirety, and it gives everything that we talk about as well this evening. But it also has maps on there giving you a sense of where the elections are going to occur. Primarily, there are only 3 states that will not see a local election from House and Senate statewide. Almost every county except for 3 will actually see an election or has already seen an election. It also talks a little bit about the budget and what was agreed to in last year's budget. A lot of people don't understand that the budget was actually 6.8, but the certification that came down in December was 5.8. So they came up with one-time funding for the 2016 budget. All right, now to get into the nuts and bolts of what we're going to talk about this evening. And please ask questions along the way. This is a very back and forth presentation, and I would strongly encourage if you have questions, but this is our best at an unbiased look at all the state questions that you will be voting on. Again, let me reiterate, hopefully you're going to vote, and if you are going to vote, make sure that you go to the election board or download this tool to make sure that you know how to vote going in, because if you don't, it goes from a 3 to 5 minute process of voting on November 8th to probably a 15 to 20 minute process, because the ballot is extremely long this year. The first state question we're going to talk about is State Question 776, and we'll go through it and kind of what it's saying, but it's the Oklahoma death penalty question. State Question 776 adds a new measure to the Oklahoma Constitution that states that all methods of execution not prohibited by the United States Constitution may be used in Oklahoma. It also specifies that if any method of execution is declared invalid, the death sentence shall remain in force until the sentence can be lawfully executed by any valid method. It states that the death penalty is not cruel and unusual punishment under Oklahoma's Constitution. Any questions so far? Okay. State question 776. What supporters say about the actual question? This measure creates flexibility for the Oklahoma legislature and our court system. It ensures that the state of Oklahoma can effectively carry out the death penalty. Opponents say, State question 776 is an unnecessary government overreach. The referendum does nothing to alter Oklahoma's ability to enact capital punishment, but could open up the state to further costly legal challenges paid for by taxpayers. Okay, that is state question 776. Any questions on what the supporters or the opponents say to state question 776? Yes, sir.
The last part of that last statement on the opponents
Yes.
could open up the state to further costly legal challenges paid for by taxpayers. What are they talking about?
Good question, and I'll repeat the question since we're being televised. The question was the last part of what opponents say in terms of, but could open up the state to further costly legal challenges paid for by taxpayers. There has been an effort in the past from the federal government to limit the ability and the specifically the drugs used in the execution of those types of issues in the execution of the death penalty. If the federal government continues to go down that path and it is challenged using some of the other alternatives to that, as well as using generic drugs, which we've read about in the last few years, the state has been in the media a few times. If that occurs, then there's a chance that our Attorney General, Scott Pruitt, could have to defend this because it's now in the Constitution all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, depending on what is actually filed. And of course, that would cost taxpayers some money in that effort to defend Oklahoma's right to perform the death penalty. If that answers, thank you. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
It just seems to me that I also read in a voter guide that was produced for a statewide effort about the idea that so many states are trying to move away from the death penalty, and this has us going in the opposite direction. I think that was one of the things also that opponents have said.
Sure. So the question is there was another statewide guide that looked at where other states are tending to go versus where Oklahoma is trying to go. And I will tell you that sometimes there will be questions, and I will try to be as unbiased and give both sides to each one of the answers. The answer is there are many states that are going in the other direction in terms of trying to clamp down on the use of death penalty, but at the same time this is not the only effort putting something into the Constitution to ensure that Oklahoma has its right to execute the death penalty outside of the realm of the federal government trying to not necessarily make it illegal, but limit the use of a certain drug in order to try to hinder the use of the death penalty.
And Oklahoma is not the only state that is pursuing measures such as this.
There are other states that are actually looking at this and putting it into the Constitution based on the efforts from our federal government.
Are they saying that some of the drugs are inhumane? Is that the issue?
Question, are they saying that some of the drugs are inhumane, and is that the issue? Yes, to a certain extent, depending on which side you're on. There are some that are saying that those drugs are inhumane, or that the generic is not as effective as the non-generic, or that some of the practices that are utilized in other states are inhumane as well. Depends. The answer to your question is yes. That's exactly what opponents are saying, but the supporters are saying that they believe that the use of these drugs is humane and based on our 10th Amendment and the giving that ability to the states, and that nothing really specifically declares the death penalty as being unused in our federal constitution, that we as a state should be allowed to utilize any means possible moving forward. Yes, ma'am.
What are some of the methods of execution not prohibited by the U.S. Constitution?
Pretty.
The gas chamber are two, right?
Yes. Those are the only two that I believe are prohibited. Now, if the U.S. Constitution, the methods that are allowed are everything except hanging and the gas chamber, as well as, like for instance, guillotine, the use of a lethal drug, the firing squad. All those are not prohibited by our federal constitution. Now, if the federal constitution did change, that would affect this question as well, because the way it is written, it would actually allow for those to be excluded, and then then Oklahoma would have to respond in like kind to change the methods that are being used if the federal constitution prohibited, because Oklahoma constitution never supersedes the federal constitution. So as if the federal constitution did change or something additionally became ineligible from our from the federal constitution perspective, that would automatically make it illegal in the state of Oklahoma as well, based on the way this question is written. These are all great questions, by the way. Any additional questions to state question 776? This is only the first one of 7. We've got a little ways to go, and I'm sure that state question 77, yes, ma'am.
In this, what I'm looking at, Oklahoma guy said, you asked a question about what are you doing now. The state penitentiary, 82 by executions.
Mm-hmm.
There was one by hanging and one of the other by lethal injection.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. It said electrocution. There was one by hanging and one of the other by lethal injection. That's what it said.
And lethal injection, for the most part, in at least recent history, has been the way that Oklahoma has executed the death penalty. Okay? All right, we'll move on to the next question. This is one that's been hotly contested. State question 777, Oklahoma agriculture. State question 777 creates a constitutional protection for farming and ranching in Oklahoma, guaranteeing the rights to make use of agricultural technology, livestock procedure, and ranching practices. This protection may not be infringed upon except in cases where the government has a compelling state interest of the highest order. Supporters say, this enumerates the right to farm and ranch, which has largely been assumed to exist in Oklahoma already, creating a constitutional protection rather than an assumed protection. This measure protects traditional agricultural practices from costly regulations that have been enacted by courts and legislatures in other states. It does not forbid any practices currently being used, such as organic farming. Opponents say, this will make it more difficult to prevent certain types of animal cruelty. This could also make future statewide planning for natural resources more difficult. With the dawn of additives, growth hormones, pesticides, and genetic modifications, it is irresponsible to take away regulation of the farming industry. Any questions on state question 777? Yes, ma'am.
Who decides whether the state has a compelling interest of the highest order?
Okay. Compelling, that would be the court. Although in certain instances, The Oklahoma legislature has already addressed some of those, specifically in water. In 2016, I believe it was Representative Terry O'Donnell actually addressed the water issue, trying to make sure that at the end of the day, that was a compelling state interest. I'm not a lawyer, but you can look at many things that would be a compelling state interest: water, natural resources, air quality. All those things could easily be classified as a compelling state interest if you go too far in terms of non-regulation. This would not, and then I will also say that this would not affect any regulation that's currently on the books. Thank you for the question.
If I could just state, we're obviously taping this and trying to get all the audio on. So
Sure.
we're running around with this.
Mike, this is our mayor.
Okay.
And runner.
Okay.
Mike, could you give us an example of where this question would be appropriate or where it would come into play with a farmer's rights versus the state or vice versa?
We've been following State Question 777 since, and this one, by the way, and the first question were both legislative referendums, and I should have started with that. This one ran through the legislature, and any legislative referendum doesn't have to be signed by the governor, but it has to basically pass both the House and Senate. This is the second legislative referendum that is on the ballot. The question is there specific examples where this could affect? And I have seen State Question 777 in an effort earlier today, the first one, because the corporate farming issue has started to come up quite a bit versus the family farmer issue. And I believe that the people who are running State Question 777 and the campaign consultants that are running that question have started to address that. Okay. In terms of corporate farming versus family farming, they are basically saying that it's going to protect both, and equally, because for the most part they both have the same interest. But in terms of where this would be in effect, let's say, for example, and I refer to this example quite often. It's California. There was a bill that went through the legislature that increased the cage size of chickens, and for the first time since World War II, eggs in California were no longer the cheapest form of protein, and that they basically doubled or almost tripled the size of those cages in a realm in an effort to try to decrease animal cruelty. But at the same time, there was no real discussion in terms of how that would affect the consumer, which is also a compelling state interest because that affects the cost of food. And I think that other states have already adopted something similar to State Question 777. And this is an attempt to try to hinder DEQ in Oklahoma, hinder the EPA's reach at the federal level if they push something down. This is an attempt to try to limit regulation, but at the same time, many people on the other side, which I try to present both, are saying that this goes too far in terms of her protection, because at the end of the day, they won't be able to. It's too high of a standard, as was stated in the compelling state interest, of the highest order. That's too high of a legal standard to actually allow for additional regulation to occur. Thank you for the question. Other questions on State Question 777?
Does this mean that there'll be zero regulation?
No. The regulations that are currently in place or future regulations that are proposed by any entity that is regulating the farming industry, those can still be put in place. The issue is this does protect what I would classify as the traditional farming and ranching practices. There's also been an effort in the past to hinder the farmer's ability to be able to use a corral, to be able to use branding, to be able to use those kinds of things, as well as pesticides, and we addressed that as one of the opponents. This would give additional protections as that debate continues to flare in the United States. And there are outside entities that would oppose this because they want to be able to hinder hinder the production of protein, and this would propose a slowdown of that hindrance. But like I said, the opponents to this would say that this is too far-reaching and would disallow their ability in its entirety to regulate the industry, which, based on my knowledge and discussions of my past life in the legislature, I'm a recovering legislator, I would say that probably doesn't completely hinder it, but it does raise it to a new level within the realm of the judiciary.
So how would this question, what kind of impact does it have on future statewide planning? It says here to make it more difficult.
That's water. That's water. So you've seen some of the ads. I think there's even one right out here straight south of Guthrie, because I drive I-35 going to root on my Cowboys. But in terms of water, I think that's one of the arguments against State Question 777. Now, the legislature did go ahead and place in statute that water would be a compelling state interest, because they knew this was one of the issues that would probably come up as they were debating this state question.
Which makes that a moot point.
Now, from the opponent's perspective, they would probably say, well, you can change state law much easier than you can actually run a campaign to change the Oklahoma Constitution, which is true. But as a former legislator, I will also tell you that it's extremely hard to change state law as well. And it was, per our founders, designed to be such.
So do puppy mills fit under this?
Based on, I would say that the question is do puppy mills fit under this? I don't see a hindrance, and I was the House author of the bill that actually made sure that we, from a perspective of not allowing puppy mills, I don't think that this state question actually hinders that. And that is currently the state law anyway. Puppy mills is a side issue that certain groups want to make a very prominent issue, but I don't believe that this would actually completely hinder the ability to regulate those puppy mills, specifically because they're already under state statute.
And that's one of the things that's outlined in this vote judgment about the puppy mills. Serious unintended consequences would give puppy mills, cockfighters, and factory farm employees license to treat vulnerable creatures.
I'm not right. That's somebody else's. Yeah, that's what opponents say, and that's fair. And we hear that argument as well. But I think that if you read State Question 777 and start to understand the purpose of State Question 777 as well as state statute, I have a hard time coming to the conclusion that it would disallow all regulation of those types of entities.
If you could, in order to get the audio, you could wait till I get to you. I know I'm not as quick as I used to be, but I'm trying.
Okay, I'd just like to say that one of the things that really resonated with me was the idea that no local, city, county entity could pass any laws, that this would supersede that our elected officials, maybe in the next biggest class, they may see some issues that need to be addressed.
Sure.
They wouldn't be able to do that because the Constitution will have been changed to allow this. And, I'm in favor of farms and local farmers and all of that, but the idea that this is something that has really been brought to us from outside to make it more feasible for corporate farms, that's the sense that I have with that.
Okay. I'll attempt to address that question. I don't know that this has been brought to us from somebody outside, because if you look at who's actually running the state question and who's behind it, it's all of our farming entities statewide. So I don't know that it's outside. I will say that I do hear that from local entities, and many local communities have taken a position of being opposed to State Question 777, especially mayors, city councils, and those have taken some positions opposed to that. But state law also supersedes what local entities, because that is also a subsidiary of the state, just as counties are and cities are. So if something in state statute versus the Constitution gets passed, then that would actually disallow the city from actually being able to do that as well. But I do believe that this is an effort from Oklahoma entities to actually protect, and then I believe that there is also a local effort from local entities to oppose as well.
You gave us a great example on what supporters say about State Question 777. Can you offer us something that opponents have to say about the state question?
Sure. And we kind of went through that beginning, and then there was a few that were also added from the puppy mills perspective, and then also from the local community not being able to pass something to hinder, let's say, for example, zoning and those types of issues. I think that that's something that local communities are wrestling with. But I think that what you see on the screen is kind of what we've seen from what opponents say. This is one that's going to be heavily supported from probably the rural areas of our state, pretty heavily supported probably from our suburban areas, could be more 50-50, and then urban areas will be a little bit more hesitant to adopt this as part of our Oklahoma Constitution. Yes, ma'am.
Has the state of Oklahoma to this point acted to prohibit local governments from protecting their interests when it comes to agriculture?
I don't know the answer to that question in its entirety. State law and the Oklahoma legislature passes many laws that affect the ability of local communities from being able to actually pass something. I don't know anything off the top of my head in terms of if they've done something specifically. They've, for the most part, continue to allow for those local communities to make those decisions. And this would probably not completely prohibit based on our reading of what State Question 777, this would not completely prohibit local communities from being able to do so as well, as long as it falls within the guidelines of the Oklahoma Constitution. But the answer to your question, I can't completely answer. There's a whole lot of titles within state law. There's a whole lot of bills that are passed on a yearly basis. I can't answer your question in its entirety. So. All right, we've stayed on state question. We're about halfway through our time, and we're only two questions in. 779. Here's another one that is interesting. This one, by the way, this is the first initiative petition that you will see on your ballot. State Question 779 increases the state sales tax by 1%, with revenues directed to common education, career tech, and higher education. It raises the minimum teacher salary by $5,000 per year. It also forbids the legislature from reducing appropriations to education based on the FY 2017 budget, which is current fiscal year. What do supporters say? Oklahoma teachers are underpaid, which has caused many would-be teachers to seek employment elsewhere or select a different profession. This measure is the only way to adequately fund education in Oklahoma, provide raises for teachers, and improve student preparedness. Opponents say, this will give Oklahoma the highest sales tax rates in the nation, making this a substantial regressive tax disproportionately impacting those with low incomes. The proposal will unnecessarily restrict the legislature when budgeting. The proposal could inhibit cities across the state from utilizing their own sales tax increase for municipal projects.
Could you explain that second opponent?
The question is explain the second what opponents say. This proposal will unnecessarily restrict the legislature when budgeting. We'll go back to this original, or kind of the layman's terms of what the actual state question does. At the very bottom, it also forbids the legislature from reducing appropriations to education based on the FY 2017 budget. It's called supplanting language. And basically what that does is that says that the Oklahoma legislature, no matter how much they want to decrease, let's say, for example, and we can point to even this year, that there is a $1.3 billion budget shortfall. And it's been well documented statewide. If this were to be in place, that $1.3 billion would not have come from education no matter what. So the issues like Department of Human Services, the issues like Department of Corrections, everything outside of the realm of higher education, career tech, and common education would have to actually take the entire brunt of the reduction in the state budget. So moving forward, let's say in 2018, there's a $1 billion shortfall. That $1 billion cannot come from career tech, higher ed, and common education, which makes up approximately 52 to 53% of our entire appropriated state budget. Yes. Hold on one second. Yes. A few things. The shortfalls probably stem from the reduction in our gross production tax, the reduction in terms of our income tax, probably based around the energy production of the state of Oklahoma, and a slowing down of our economy from a jobs and an increase in jobs perspective. Basically, during the time frame of 2004 to 2007, we saw tremendous increases because natural gas was extremely high at the time. I believe there was a time where natural gas actually was at $15. So we saw a tremendous increase quickly. But since that time, there's been a slowing down of the economy. But then there was also an increase of the economy. It's primarily due to the volatile prices of oil and natural gas.
What you're saying then is the state has not made corrections in their spending.
So the question is refer to page 2. The question is they have not made corrections to their spending. I would have to say that every legislature has to look at the money that they have in front of them and to make sure that they are making the correct decisions. But spending has not reduced since 2000. I think in 2004, when I was first elected, the overall budget was somewhere in the vicinity of $5.4 billion, and today it's somewhere in the vicinity of 6.8.
Well, wasn't it not very long ago that there was a big thing about the governor saying that the budget was balanced and all this kind of stuff was going on?
And the budget is balanced. But the issue is that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a reduction in the budget, or that they have actually taken a look at efficiencies within the budget. But the budget is always, it has to be balanced by our Constitution. So when...
Well, if the budget's balanced, then how can there, if you're not spending more than you're taking in and the budget is balanced, how can there be a shortfall? I mean, I'm just a common, ordinary person.
Sure.
I'm just wondering,
So
how does this work? I'd like to do it at my house.
Fair. So basically what happens is we go off of estimates. The Oklahoma legislature funds off of estimates. So each year, the Board of Equalization, and we're getting into the weeds a little bit now, but the Board of Equalization will certify a certain number for the Oklahoma legislature to actually appropriate. If that number is incorrect, then there is a quote-unquote budget shortfall. If it is above because we've seen additional growth, thank you. If it's above because we've seen additional growth, then there will be a budget increase or...
What the
Correct.
spending's going to be.
Not what the spending's going to be, and what the amount that they will be able to spend. Correct. That's based on the Board of Equalization certification in December.
And my next question, right quick, is
Sure.
I thought it talked about the only way to fund education. I thought there was something to do with some kind of lotteries a while back that was going to fund the education. What happened? I mean,
I don't keep up with all this. That's why I'm asking.
Sure. Great questions. In 2004, the Oklahoma people decided to endorse the lottery and to bring that into our state. It did raise money, and all those monies do go to education. But again, let me reiterate, I don't know specifically what the lottery is bringing in today, but I remember from a few years ago what it's bringing in. And I will tell you the overall spending on common education alone. That's $2.3 billion. The lottery money brings in somewhere between, since the conception or the beginning of it, somewhere between $35 and $100 million. So you're talking about a small amount of money relatively to the overall budget, if that makes sense.
So what's being done to put a cap on educational spending? And the reason I'm saying this is because I come from, you had a pencil, you had a ruler, and you had some paste. And so we got a pretty good education. So what's the problem with putting a cap on this education spending? What's being done to stop so much of this spending?
Based on, and I will refer back to this, and this kind of talks you through some of it. The answer, I don't believe that there's anything that's being done specifically to hinder spending in terms of educational spending. They have not seen a growth, which is they will make the argument, and I'm trying to be fair to both sides. Those within the education system will make the argument that cost of goods have gone up, but they have not seen an increase in their overall state spending, which is why we have not seen an increase in teacher pay or an increase in the amounts of money that are going to general appropriation from schools.
What about the the potential impact on especially small municipalities throughout Oklahoma, which live on sales tax? We're the only state in the country where municipalities do not get anything like property tax, ad valorem tax, that the main revenue streams are sales tax. And with this increase, what's the potential impact on those, especially small towns, which need this for increasing and improving quality of life, those kinds of things that are crucial for our citizens?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Mayor. I would say that is one of the things that opponents to this state question specifically focus on. And you're correct that for the most part, I mean, there are other funding sources for cities, but the majority of those funds come from sales tax. If you increase it by 1 penny, what is, if I might ask, what is the sales tax for the city of Guthrie?
8
8 3/4. So that would almost bring you to almost 10 pennies on the dollar, or 10%. That would probably, we know for a fact that we have high sales tax in Oklahoma now. What opponents do say is that if you increase that by 1 penny and you do raise us so much, especially in areas where we are close to Kansas, Texas, Arkansas, New Mexico, Colorado, all the states that actually are bordering, there's going to be a cooling effect in terms of their ability to be able to compete. At the same time, there are a lot of things that you here in the city of Guthrie do fund for the specific programs that you have in place. And it could make it more difficult even into the future to actually pass the extensions of those sales tax. And that's probably the greatest argument against the passage of 779, as we move forward. Public safety, economic development, and, you know, of course, at the Chamber, we are very involved and very supportive of economic development statewide, and those many times are supported by that local sales tax.
Would you
Yes.
present as well-spoken of an argument for 779 as you did against 779?
Sure. So basically, and you know, as a former legislator, 779 is extremely important for teachers. Teachers and our retention of teachers. If you look at where they're going and some of the people who are leaving the profession, especially into other professions or other states, this is something that I think is extremely important. It also contributes to the economies of our higher education facilities and people, because higher education, of course, as you look at higher education and how that affects our economy in general, that is extremely important to our state, and making sure that we have those higher ed degrees. I know that the governor has actually made that one of her focuses as she's continued in her second term as governor. And then career tech. I can't say enough about career tech. Whenever I was a legislator in Enid, Autry Technology Center was one of the best programs that we had putting forward from an economic development standpoint as well.
Okay, approximately how many teaching jobs are open today as we speak during this school year?
Quite a few, and the question was, is there a lot of teachers' jobs that are actually open? The answer is yes, and I think that as we move forward, the last time, and I'll continue to talk about how the legislature has failed to actually address this issue. The last time I believe a $3,000 pay increase actually occurred was in 2007. That being said, I will, as I talk well about it, I have to also talk the other side. At the same time, I think that there are some that are saying that you could address some of the funding inequities in other ways rather than a sales tax. And I think that that's kind of the debate that's spurring around 779. Yes, sir. Hold on one second.
Oh, our teachers do need a raise. I understand that. My question would be, if this would pass, how would it be distributed proportionally? Would it be based upon tenure?
No, this is 5,000 across the board pay increase based on the amount of money that your local school district submits to the Board of Education every May and June. Not every school district, and I don't know what Guthrie does, but not every school district pays the state minimum. If you pay above the state minimum, you actually submit. The state minimum is 33.8 or something along those lines. So if you have additional money and you want to actually increase your minimum for your teacher, you can do so in an application and a process by which you submit that to the Board of Education. This would be an across-the-board $5,000 increase to every teacher. And it would also be a certain amount of money going to general appropriations or appropriations for higher education, and then a significantly smaller amount going to career tech.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I just have a couple of quick questions. Did I hear correctly that you made the observation that the shortfall in revenue is due to the downturn in the energy sector?
That is definitely part of it. It's been well documented that is part of the reason why there's a little bit of a downturn. Anytime the oil and natural gas prices go down, it does tend to affect those that are areas specifically that are heavily involved in that activity. I mean, I used to represent Enid, which had the large increases in the 2007 to 2014 sector from an energy perspective, as well as all the people who were receiving royalty checks in and around the area as well.
Okay, I think then, based upon that reality, I think that bodes or speaks more to the fact that our economy is a lack of diversification therein. And having grown up in the unemployment lines in Michigan during the late 70s and early 80s,
Yep.
I think that's an issue that we need to address. And furthermore, I don't think we have an unemployment problem in Oklahoma. Matter of fact, it's very low. What we have is a quality job situation.
Sure.
And our economy is being driven by energy. And as a result, there's a skills gap, not an unemployment problem. And I think that's under-resourced because the educators can't provide jobs that the technical field needs.
Sure.
We have 2,000 open positions in the technical field right now that pay a ton of money. And our
Fair.
educators can't push out the talent that we need, so we leave.
Fair point. Diversification has been one of Oklahoma's, and specifically the Oklahoma legislature and governors, all the way from Brett Henry to Governor Fallon, their specific focus. I mean, we've seen tremendous growth in aerospace. We've seen tremendous growth in other types of sectors, defense and technological jobs, healthcare, and the research side of healthcare. We've seen that down in OU. I do want to point out the fact that for the first time for a long time, I believe the last time was in the 80s, we do actually eclipse the national average in terms of unemployment. So there is not an unemployment problem, but Oklahoma is starting to see the effects of what has occurred from an energy price perspective. And I think that is affecting the overall, but your point is well taken in terms of diversification. And that's one of the things that the chamber has focused on. Now I'm getting over onto my other job, is making sure that jobs do come to our state, that they're in many different sectors. That is part of my job as working at the state chamber. And Fred has really, our president and CEO has really tasked us with trying to make sure that Oklahoma is poised and ready to diversify as well.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you. All right, moving on to the next one. We're about halfway through and we have 10 minutes. State question 780 and 781, justice reform. State question 780 reduces all simple drug possession and property crimes under 1,000 to misdemeanors from felonies. State question 781 uses savings from state question 780 to fund rehabilitation services like drug rehab and alternative sentencing. 781 can only go into effect if 780 passes. Supporters say Oklahoma has the highest incarceration rate in the country, creating huge costs for housing nonviolent criminals. Felonies for simple drug possession and property crimes have contributed to the workforce shortage, negatively impacting economic growth and burdening taxpayers. State question 780 will save the state a lot of money, so it makes sense to invest some of those savings into better treatment and rehabilitation programs in state question 781. What do opponents say? To reduce prison overcrowding, we should reduce the sentences for nonviolent crimes. However, these crimes should still remain felonies so that potential employers are aware of criminal behavior. State question 781 creates a financial obligation for the state based on certain, very uncertain, arbitrary, and subjective calculations. Questions on state question 780 or 781? Yes, ma'am.
Do we still have private prisons?
We do. Now, the federal government is moving away from private prisons, but the state of Oklahoma still does have private prisons and still actively pursues those prisons.
So this is what I find weird. Private prisons, you're going to need to have criminals to go in there. So, get the laws so the criminals go in there and fill up the private prisons. So, it'd be good to get rid of those.
Mm-hmm. I think that private prisons are an essential part of Oklahoma's strategy to those that are in the system, because right now in our DOC system we're extremely full. It also that reality also affects counties. And I heard on a daily basis how that affected Garfield County, which I used to represent, and they were basically 90% full as well, and most of those were DOC inmates. Just to kind of give you a sense, and I talked a little bit about the high incarceration rate. We in Oklahoma rank first in incarceration in women, and we rank fourth in incarceration of men. But that being said, the opponents will say that at the end of the day, the reducing from the $1,000 threshold in terms of property, or increasing to $1,000 in terms of property, will affect how employers are aware of how their employees are moving forward in terms of any kind of drug paraphernalia or drug problem that they might have. Misdemeanors do not show up on a background check. Yes, ma'am.
Possession based on the fact that it's under $1,000 worth or whatever it is, or
Yes.
or what is that?
Yes, and that can be different for each drug. For example, methamphetamine might, and there is already I believe a scale that is used by the district attorneys, and each drug will be different in terms of the actual amount needed to eclipse the 1,000. Do what?
A simple drug is based on the amount of money and not the drug itself. A simple drug possession isn't based on maybe marijuana against cocaine or something like that. It's the money it's the money is what determines that?
It's the amount of money that drug is currently worth.
Okay, okay.
So the second part of that says the money, the funds would go to rehabilitation services, drug rehab, alternative sentencing. Would it go to places that are already here, facilities that are already doing those kind of things? Because I know they're very underfunded. Or are they going to create new things?
I think, and I don't know I don't know that anybody knows the answer to that in its entirety, but my guess would be if 780 and 781 both do pass, that it would probably fund those programs that are already in place, as well as look at funding programs that are currently not available.
So one can be passed and the other not. So what happens?
Correct. Well, if 780 passes, then the program goes into place. But what 781 does, and that was the second argument opposed, which 781 creates a financial obligation. What 781 basically states is that OMES would basically be allowed to certify a number in terms of the money saved based on the less incarceration of criminals. And then that number would basically go towards this effort. And there's no real spelling out of how they would actually come up with the amount used to fund the program. Yes, sir.
A moment ago, you said that misdemeanors don't appear on background checks. Will you please elaborate on which background checks those don't?
Well,
because I know
usually,
several
right,
they do.
right. It depends, but usually the ones if an employer actually does do a background check or looks at some of the things there, most misdemeanors, which can be a traffic ticket or those types of things, don't. Where felonies do show up pretty quickly unless they've been completely expunged. And I think that that's one of the main opponents to this is not that they don't believe that it's needed, that maybe an alteration to the way it was written is needed to ensure that people that do eclipse that property threshold, at least letting the employer know that that is a common occurrence.
Okay. I worked with the courts for 16 years.
Sure.
I respectfully disagree with you on the background check.
Okay.
Mike, you had mentioned the high level of incarceration
Sure.
In our state, and especially females, but across the board. Do you have any idea of where the state sets in any kind of a rating among other states in the financial obligation for mental health and substance abuse that
It's a great
781
question, and I don't know
addresses?
how we rank there in terms of comparative to other states, but I will find out in terms of how we rate. I do know that since 2010 we've seen a tremendous increase in the funding. That is one of Governor Fallon's main pushes, is to increase the funding towards mental health, specifically those that are incarcerated and part of the mental health system, because the supporters of State Question 780 have continually said that many of these instances where they are incarcerated could be forms of mental health rather than quote-unquote criminal behavior. Okay? All right. 790, Blaine Amendment. Repeals a section of the state constitution commonly referred to as the Blaine Amendment. This prohibits the use of public property or expenditures for religious purposes, most notably the issue that was created by the Oklahoma Supreme Court's ruling that the Ten Commandments monument had to be removed from the state capitol complex. Supporters say this measure will enhance the First Amendment and partnerships between the government and charitable organizations that have religious affiliations, such as the Salvation Army. Without this amendment, many well-intentioned organizations, such as the Boy Scouts, may not be able to hold meetings or events at public facilities like schools. Opponents say this will erode the separation of church and state. This will allow for scholarships and taxpayer dollars supporting students to attend religious private schools.
That's not on our list, but
Yeah, it's an addition because as we have gone, this is not the first time I've presented this. This is one of the arguments that has recently come up. So that's not on the original supporters and opponents say, but that is one of the arguments that we have continually heard as we presented this statewide. Questions on the Blaine Amendment? Yes, ma'am.
Why are you calling it the Blaine Amendment?
The Blaine Amendment was something that was adopted, I don't remember, 1920s, 30s, but it was based on U.S. Senator, I believe, and they have dubbed it the Blaine Amendment. And that is something that as they continue to change that, that's kind of the origination, and many states adopted that amendment and put it into their constitution whenever that whole thing came down. I can't remember the specific time frame, but each state actually adopted it into their constitution, and this is an alteration of that amendment, which the Oklahoma Supreme Court made its ruling on the Ten Commandments, based off of the amendment that was adopted in the past by Oklahoma in the Constitution.
So let's say that the Blaine Amendment wasn't in the Oklahoma Constitution, and that Supreme ruling or Supreme Court ruling had come down. Would the federal government's amendment at the federal level, let's say it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, would that not have stopped us at any way? You see where I'm going with this? So
Possibly. There is a chance that could have stopped us anyway, but depends on which court system you're in, and this one was filed in the Oklahoma Supreme Court, and they referred specifically to the amendment that was adopted by our Oklahoma Constitution. In that amendment that was adopted, that was given to each state to either adopt or not, and Oklahoma did. Yeah.
I have a statement and a clarifying question about the state question. So as I read State Question 790, to me, what I hear from people is that they believe that this would open up religious freedoms for Christians specifically. However, my clarifying question to you is, will this open up other religions besides Christianity to public schools?
Possibly. I think that that would be something that would be definitely challenged. That is one of the things that many of the people who like the idea of 790 and don't. The reason why this was so heavily discussed in the legislature, and this is in a legislative referendum as well, is because of the actual decision that came down and some of the statements on the majority decision, because it got very broad and it could affect even non-religious affiliated organizations. And that's what was talked about in terms of Boy Scouts and their ability to be able to use even school facilities or public facilities. And that's the reason why there was an effort. The origination of it was definitely the Ten Commandments and the discussion that occurred there. As I've presented this, could a non-Christian entity then do some sort of a public display on public ground if this was to pass? Possibly. I think that there would probably be a large outcry. But that being said, it could possibly go down that path. Other questions to the Blaine Amendment? And then we have one more state question, and I'll open up to any additional questions, and hopefully you've enjoyed the presentation so far. If you have any questions, we can be further assistance as we move forward. But the last one that we're going to take up, this was a legislative referendum as well. State Question 792, alcohol modernization. State Question 792 restructures Oklahoma's alcohol laws to be comparable with the majority of other states. The major provisions of the reforms will eliminate the distinction between low point and high point beer, allows grocery stores to sell wine and high point beer, allows liquor stores to sell refrigerated beer and non-alcoholic products like soft drinks, and move regulation from the Constitution to state law. Supporters say, Oklahoma is one of few states that still make distinctions between high and low point beer. Regulations regarding the sale of alcohol are confusing, outdated, and impractical. This will create economic growth with local wineries. Opponents say this will put many liquor stores out of business. This will expand the opportunity for underage drinking.
You know what, a convenience stores? Sorry.
It's okay. Questions on State Question 792. Again, this was a legislative referendum that was highly discussed and highly talked about and altered many, many times in the legislative process.
Do you have any stats on other states? I mean, like you said, we're one of the few states
Yeah.
that hasn't passed this on liquor store closings.
I don't have any statistics in terms of liquor store closings, but I have traveled in states that don't have a difference between high point and low point beer, and it looks like liquor stores are still prevalent within those states.
Well, I was going to make that same comment.
Sure.
But I don't think that we ought to not pass it to protect liquor stores from going out of business. So, I mean.
Good point.
But there are places where the liquor store is right next door to a grocery store and they're still selling the same stuff. So, you know, that's not an, I think it's time.
Could you explain move regulation from state constitution to
Yes,
state law?
thank you for the question. The question was, can I explain moving that from state constitution to state statute? And that's kind of what they're trying to do. The three-tier system has been in place since Prohibition, for the most part. But now they are trying to address those issues as they come about a little bit quicker. If they pass 792, the Oklahoma legislature will be able to affect things like underage drinking much quicker, look at things to be more responsive to issues that could affect the sale